Welcome, everyone, to the Fantasy and Betting Podcast presented by the 33rd Team. I'm your host, as always, Josh Larky, joined, as always, by my co-host, Ryan Reynolds. We are going to be previewing the Week 8 NFL action after 6 teams on bye last week. There are no teams on bye this week. I ran the numbers back to at least 2013. We have not seen this happen. 6 teams on bye one week, followed by none the next. We'll get right into it. The Giants will be hosting the Jets. Giants were 2.5-point underdogs. That's moved to Giants 3-point underdogs. The game total has stayed firm at a nice low 36.5. When we look at the Giants, I think Saquon's in for a pretty good game. People hear Jets and they think, oh, that's scary defense. Jets have actually been slightly friendly to running backs this year. Pretty league average 4 yards per carry allowed. But in the pass game, which is where Saquon's often excelled for fantasy, the Jets allow the second most receptions and fourth most receiving yards per game to running backs. And then the one other way that you can exploit the Jets is with tight ends. No team has allowed more fantasy points a game to tight ends than the Jets, probably because they're creating a lot of pressure on quarterbacks and they need to throw short. Hence, running backs, tight ends, think they're going to be in for some good games. Probably pretty good for Wan'Dale Robinson. I think he's a flex option this week. Ryan, what are you looking for on the Giants side of things?
I mean, they've had a pretty non-functional offense all year, and if Daniel Jones ends up being the quarterback, he's very pressure sensitive. That's been his problem since he was in college, and the Jets have a pretty significant trench advantage in this matchup. So it's a good thing that Saquon Barkley and Darren Waller in plus matchups because they don't have a lot of room elsewhere this week.
I wrote an article on the 33rdteam.com, free to read, about different teams that spark good and bad offensive environments for fantasy. The Giants were one that sparks bad environments for the pass game simply because the Giants can't score points. The other team doesn't really need to pass all that much, and the Giants are just so beatable on the ground. This is all shaping up perfectly for Breece Hall. Why would you put the game in Zach Wilson's hands when the Giants are inviting you to run? We have 3 running backs with at least 21 fantasy points against the Giants, 3 others with at least 14. 6 running backs have at least 70 rushing yards. Breece Hall took over all the rushing on this team in week 5 against the Broncos. We all remember that massive spike. Then week 6, it was a little quieter, but if you look at the actual usage, he remained the bell cow on the ground and then pretty much took all the pass catching away from Michael Carter. They get the week 7 bye. Breece Hall is here. He's locked and loaded. He is my running back 7 for week 8. Anything else you're looking for from the Jets here? And I assume you're with me that we're going to see one of the most run-heavy game plans of the year from them.
Yeah, I would think so. The Jets have a better roster than the Giants, plain and simple. The Giants have 2 real paths to victory here. And the first is, you just said it. Zach Wilson's passing attack is not exactly awe-inspiring. If he plays a clean game, the Giants are in trouble. But the Giants also have a trench advantage in this matchup. So they can apply pressure on Wilson. That's their path to keeping this one close, maybe stealing one against the Jets.
Next game, we have the Panthers hosting the Texans. The battle of the number 1 and number 2 picks in Bryce Young and CJ Stroud. Panthers were 3-point underdogs. That has moved to them being 3.5-point underdogs. Game total was at 42.5. It went up a little bit to 43.5. Now, if you like the Texans in this one, Texans, as I mentioned before, 3.5-point favorites. But if you go to mybookie.com, you can get the Texans as 3-point favorites. That's a key number right there. Promo code 33rd team, 33RD team. We'll get you a 10% deposit match. Will help us stay employed. And then if you want, you can take the Texans -3. Now, if we look at the Panthers, this is supposed to be the start of the running back committee. Miles Sanders did not impress at all through the first 5 games. Week 6, he doesn't play. Chuba's a bell cow and looks pretty good. Week 7, they get the bye. And then the coaching staff came out and said that it's going to be a committee hot hand type approach. Other thing that I'm looking for, will rookie second-round receiver Jonathan Mingo take on a larger role after the bye? We often see rookies increase their involvement post-bye. We saw that with Jackson Smith and Jigba. And right now, where this pass game has been funneled almost exclusively through veteran Adam Thielen, it's worked. Thielen's been great. But historically, we generally do not see a mid-30s veteran hold off a young receiver with draft capital post-bye. And then on the Texans side, I think they can score pretty much however they want. Carolina is allowing over 5 yards a carry to running backs, second most in the league. Carolina just also happens to be allowing the 6th best passing efficiency to quarterbacks. Stroud himself is 4th in pass yards a game, 4th in yards per attempt. I think the Texans can hang quite a few points on them here. I think CJ Stroud is a pretty decent streamer this week. The one concern is that Dameon Pierce and Devin Singletary are simply too efficient on the ground. What are your other notes in this game with the battle between the 1st and 2nd overall picks?
On the Houston side, what I'm curious about this week is if their running game sees a bit of a spike this week. Dameon Pierce is getting hit in the backfield a lot so far this year, and the Panthers have gotten shredded on the ground. So looking to see if he can have a pretty good bounce back spot here. His after last week, his rushing yard total in prop markets is 53.5. Seems like suspiciously a little high. So curious to see if he beats that. And for the Panthers side, Thomas Brown's taking over as play caller. I hope he moves Bryce Young out of the pocket, rolls him right, tries to manufacture a few completions for him, try to get him going earlier. And like you said, I hope Jonathan Mingo sees a bigger role. That will be an interesting thing because, how long can we count on Adam Thielen at this point?
Guys, that's Ryan Reynolds NFL on Twitter. Ryan's watched every snap of every game since 2014. He still lives to tell about it. He talks about football in a very unique way where he's watching all the film. He's also extremely numbers literate. That's a tough combo to find. His expert picks and predictions for every game just hit the site today. Make sure you check that out, and then make sure you tune back in on Saturday when hitting the33rdteam.com is what Ryan will be betting on and looking for in every single game. Speaking of every single game, another game we have is Commanders hosting the Eagles, the rematch. The first game was surprisingly close, wasn't it, Ryan? And it looks like bettors out there do not think this one will be as close. Commanders were 6.5-point underdogs when it opened. That's moved to +7. Commanders now full touchdown underdogs. Game total remains at 43.5. When we look at the Commanders, this backfield's now just a 3-way committee. It's pretty gross. Week 6, Brian Robinson had 10 carries. Chris Rodriguez had 4 carries, and I was like, oh, we don't love that. And then in week 7, Robinson had 8 carries, and Chris Rodriguez had 7. And then we also have Antonio Gibson. He's running the most routes on the team. He's their pass-catching back. I do not like 3-way splits in a running back room and a bad offense. Would not recommend starting any of these guys this week in fantasy. I would recommend streaming Sam Howell if you need to. Eagles have allowed the 10th most fantasy points a game to quarterbacks. Essentially, their pass defense hasn't been quite as good as last year, but their offense has still been very good. And that sets up nice game environments for the opposing quarterback. And as a result of both quarterbacks needing to pass a lot and the pressure the Eagles create, if you're playing in PPR formats, the Eagles allow the 2nd most fantasy points a game to receivers. They're getting a ton of receptions, a ton of quick passing, and that's kind of what you need when it's a Commanders team that's really spread the ball around. So I'm streaming Sam Howell. I'm playing Terry McLaurin fairly confidently here. Anything else you're looking for on the Commanders side?
Yeah, Washington also beat Philly they were the first team to beat Philly last year, so they've kind of given them tough games in each of the last 2 seasons. That said, I want to talk about Sam Howell real quick because he's interesting. Like we talked about yesterday with our series with Player Profiler member Theo, who I also streamed with today. Sam Howell plays just well enough to get you in trouble. He's in some ways he's the perfect Commanders quarterback because they haven't really ever had stability at the position, and he's kind of like a really good version of Tyler Heineke. So, but in this matchup, like you said, Josh, Eagles pass rush, big time trench advantage in this matchup. And I'll add this. Last week, I think the Eagles had their Eagles secondary had their best game of the year. So if Philly won this game with some distance, and that's where the line's moving to, it really wouldn't stun me.
Yeah, as we mentioned each and every week, Howell pacing to break the single season sacks taken record by 20. I think the Eagles fantasy defense is a great one. Not that they're available on waivers, but for anyone out there that has 2 defenses and one of them the Eagles, you should probably just start the Eagles. Speaking of the Eagles offense, Washington has allowed a league high 16.7 yards per reception to receivers this year. That smells pretty tantalizing for A.J. Brown, who has 5 straight games now with at least 125 receiving yards. Overall, we've had 6 receivers hit 98 yards against Washington this year, 7 receivers, at least 19 PPR fantasy points against Washington. This could be a good day for the pass game. And one prop I'm looking at is Devonta Smith, just to see what happens there. Last year, we saw Smith and Brown as relative equals. This year, Brown's definitely pulled ahead. The prop right now, it's about 2 times higher in the receiving yards markets for Brown compared to Smith. And Smith in the 40s feels quite low against the Commanders. Haven't taken it yet, but that is definitely one that's on my mind. Anything else you're looking for here from the Eagles?
Yeah, agreed. I don't think it's just a production thing. I think AJ Brown's just better than Devonta Smith, where it's a bit like the Jamar Chase, T. Higgins situation where, yeah, Devonta Smith's a really good receiver who would be the top option on a number of teams. But in this one, there's a pretty big gap. That said, I do think the gap's a little wider than reality. So I could see, I love that you're on that too with Smith. I'm interested in that as well. I'll probably play him in DFS a little bit this week. So looking forward to discussing that more from a props aspect.
Yeah, we'll have our top DFS plays from the two of us, our head of DFS, Jordan Vanek, and our lead analyst, Hilo. That comes out on Saturdays. The Hurt Smith stack might be treating us pretty well this weekend.
Yep.
One game that's probably not going to treat us well is Dolphins hosting the Patriots. This might be a pretty brutal watch. We'll kind of have to see. The first matchup was a little interesting, but since then the Patriots have really fallen off a cliff. It did open, though, at Dolphins 10-point favorites. That's moved. Dolphins are only 9-point favorites now. Game totals at 46.5, pretty healthy. Most of that on the Dolphins end. What I'm looking at is that last week, Raheem Mostert and Salvin Ahmed were the top 2 running backs. I think Jeff Wilson's going to take over for Ahmed sooner rather than later, probably this week. I would still be stashing Wilson. I know a lot of people dropped him after he didn't get usage last week. I would certainly be picking him up in almost every single format. And then if we look at the Patriots end, it's actually not complete doom and gloom here. So the Dolphins actually allow the 5th most fantasy points a game to quarterbacks. If we dig in more, the Dolphins are pressuring quarterbacks at the 2nd highest rate in the NFL. What does that mean? Well, we should probably look at the low depth of target receivers on the Patriots. And we see that as this Patriots offense has been breaking down the past 2 weeks, Kendrick Bourne is averaging 9 targets a game the last 2 games with an average depth of target under 2 yards. He looks like the preferred option here. And then the speedy Demario Douglas, his average depth of target is at 3.5 yards. I think you can probably flex him in a pinch, but Bourne looks like the guy that I think you can confidently start and get at least something in the flex. Ryan, what are your thoughts on this game? Do you think it'll play similarly to their earlier contest, which was extremely run heavy?
Yeah, and that one, the Dolphins running game, their defense primarily won that game. One thing that's interesting to me in this contest is Dolphins are at least a fringe contender. I'm going to call them a contender in general. Well, and they're coming off a pretty bad loss in Philly last week. While the Patriots, injury-ravaged roster that wasn't that good to begin with, is coming off an upset win over Buffalo. So that disparity, one team's in a bounce-back spot, one team's in a letdown spot. I don't really do the letdown thing with Bill Belichick. That's a different animal there. But, Miami's going to be highly motivated here. They have the raw materials to blow the doors off New England a little bit. But, yes, I do expect this to be more of a defensive-minded contest rather than like a 34-20 type game. Do
you lean under 46.5? That's where I'm leaning. Haven't bet it myself, but that's a hefty amount of points for this matchup.
Yeah, if I was going to bet every under on the slate, yes, I'd take the under here.
Next game, this is actually one of the best games of the week. I think it reflects how bad a lot of these games are. Cowboys host the Rams. Cowboys opened as 6.5-point favorites. They're now just 6-point favorites. Game totals at 45.5, pretty hefty. When we look at the Cowboys, let's talk about Jake Ferguson. The Rams have struggled against tight ends this year. The first 4 weeks of the season, we loved Ferg Daddy. 6 targets a game, catching 4 of them for 37 yards, not running a lot of routes. And we were like, it'd be really fun if he ran more routes. Well, the last 2 weeks, his routes went up by 30%. And instead of 6 targets, he's been targeted 2 times per game the last couple of weeks. I think this is the bounce back game because we're getting more usage out of him in the routes run department. It's also a good matchup, but I still think he's kind of a low floor option. But if you're looking for upside at tight end, Ferguson does profile as one of the better streamers for this week. Anything else you're looking for from this Cowboys offense coming off the bye?
One thing I'll attack on for Ferguson that's a positive is, outside of Aaron Donald, the Rams don't really have a great pass rush, so he should be freed up to run routes and not have to chip in as a blocker too much. Overall, Dallas is a vastly superior roster to the Rams. We saw the Rams get beat up by the Eagles a little bit earlier in the year. There's a potential for that kind of situation again. Dallas is coming off a bye, which boils down to, does this offense finally hit its stride? Does it finally at least play towards its ceiling a little bit against a pretty beatable Rams defense?
Yeah, and then on the other end, we know the Cowboys are going to bring a lot of pressure. I think there's going to be a lot of quick passes to Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp, both going to be extremely PPR viable. When we look at the Rams running back room, Darrell Henderson, I think, is around he's like a low-end fantasy RB2 this week. Cowboys are a tough matchup for running backs. But one thing we've seen from the Rams is a commitment to the lead back. It was an 18-12 carry split between Darrell Henderson and Royce Freeman last week. But again, that's 18-12. You're not going to give Darrell Henderson 30 carries. I think there's a chance that they run the ball 22 times and then Henderson gets almost all those carries this week. He had the red zone. He had the goal line carries. Freeman did not. He also ran more routes than Royce Freeman. And this was his first game since week 11 of last year. I'm pretty bullish on at the very least, the workload for Darrell Henderson in this one. Ryan, you've been all over Stafford this year. He's played very well in almost every game. It seems like the path for the Rams here would be Stafford, Kupp, and Puka in this one.
Yeah, that's where I'm at. Stafford. I'm going to add McVay. I'll even add Tutu Atwell too. Tutu Atwell's a bit of a field stretcher. Could see him getting loose here once, but again, big time talent disparity between these two teams. Last week I liked Puka more than Kupp against the Steelers. This week I like Kupp a little bit more than Puka Nacua. Curious to see where Jordan Vanek leads later in this week for DFS players.
Let's talk about the Steelers, who host the Jaguars. Steelers opened as 2-point underdogs. They are now 2.5-point underdogs. Game total was at 42. It went down a little bit to 41. If we look at the Steelers, the last week they faced the Rams. As we talked about, they beat the Rams. The Rams have shut down running backs in the pass game. Najee Harris, big game, big surprise. Najee Harris, he's the guy that takes most of the carries. He runs it up the middle. But this week they get the Jaguars, who are allowing the most receptions and the 5th most receiving yards per game to running backs. Last week, Najee Harris game. I think this week's a Jaylen Warren game. I know in some shallow leagues, people were dropping Warren. I know a lot of people have just plopped him on their bench now. I think that you can flex him this week. And then on the Jaguar side, oh boy. Let me tell you guys about my friend Christian Kirk. Christian Kirk has been very good this year. He's been out targeting Calvin Ridley. He's been out producing Calvin Ridley. And I just took Christian Kirk over 53.5 receiving yards at -115 on my bookie. Kirk's been over that number in 5 of his last 6 games. Last year, he was 10-7 on the over. Not only does it look like a solid line at face value, but the Steelers are actually an elite matchup this year for slot receivers like Kirk. Kirk has spent 83% of his time in the slot this season. Steelers have given up the most fantasy points a game to slot receivers. If we look only at slot reps, Pittsburgh has allowed 8 players through 6 games to top Christian Kirk's line. More than 1 player per game, purely looking at slot reps, has at least 54 yards. This feels like a great play. MyBookie.com, promo code 3013, and you can bet on Christian Kirk as well at less juice than other sports books. Ryan, what are you looking for in Steelers Jags? And do you agree with the public that the game total should be going down?
Yeah, one thing that struck me with this is I was surprised by the spread a little bit because, they're basically inviting you to bet on the Jaguars. So I was surprised by that. 2 + 2 + 2.5 is an underdog spread. So again, surprised to see that. The under, I probably go a bit the other way actually. I don't think it's like a major over, but I'm thinking this is more like 24-20 type game. For the Jaguars, my big concern there is TJ Watt against right tackle Anton Harrison. Harrison's gotten better. Cam Robinson's back at left tackle, so the tackle situations for Jacksonville, has been better. It's one of the things that's coincided with their winning streak here. But TJ Watt right now, if the season ended today, he's a defensive player of the year. Don't think it's close. And I say that as a guy who has a bunch of Micah Parsons tickets from when markets opened months ago. But Watt's been the guy who's driven. He's been the most impactful defensive player so far this season. And now on the other side of things, Kenny Pickett needs to go and win a game this week is how I see this one. Do I want to bet on that exactly? Probably going to pass, but that's how I see this. This is a game for Kenny Pickett to take a step forward.
Yeah, Kenny Pickett had his best game of the year last week averaged over 9 yards per pass attempt. It was the first full game with George Pickens and Deontay Johnson. Jaguars are a beatable defense for receivers. So yeah, I actually was kind of surprised as well. This game has been trending under. Next, we have the Colts hosting the Saints. The Colts opened up as 1.5-point favorites, and people laughed. Now the Colts are 1-point underdogs, 2.5 points of line movement, especially flip-flopping it. You don't see that every single week. Game totals at 44. With the Colts, I mentioned this on our Monday recap show. Jonathan Taylor was more efficient than Zach Moss on the ground and through the air last week. That was the first time through their 3 games overlapping that we'd seen that. I think Taylor takes on at more of a 60-40, 65-35 split this week. And I would say that if he doesn't, then I'm going to be very concerned. And Jonathan Taylor might be falling in my rest of season rankings and trade value chart, might be dropping down a tier. Those are free on the 33rdteam.com. And that trade value chart is downloadable as a PDF. I've certainly been using that to evaluate all the trades in my leagues. One thing that's these two teams have in common, Colts Saints, they allow a top 12 amount of fantasy points to slot receivers. That's good news for Josh Downs. And that is actually good news for, and this might sound like a cop-out, Chris Olave, Michael Thomas, and Rashid Shaheed. Well, Josh, you just listed all the receivers. It's because all 3 of Olave, Shaheed, and Michael Thomas have run between 120 and 160 routes from the slot. I could see a huge game from any of these guys against the Colts. I think we'd obviously lean Olave, given that he's been the target leader, but I don't think it would surprise me if any of these guys had an 80-plus yard performance. Anything else you're looking for here from the Saints and Colts?
My immediate reaction when I saw this game is I like the Saints, so the line movement doesn't surprise me. This is a bit of a letdown spot for Gardner Minshew's passing attack. I love Gardner Minshew, have for years, but I don't think what they did last week is all that sustainable. And the Saints have a good overall defense, pretty good run defense, where I don't think they're going to be able to get the success they had against Cleveland last week. And just to throw this in here, one of the most surprising aspects of this season so far is Zach Moss is second in the league in rushing yards right now. That's got to stop. Probably start stopping this week. And then on the other side, I'm with you. I'm with you on the Saints passing attack. Derek Carr has some touchdown regression coming, has some big plays coming his way. His shoulder injury is 4 weeks in the past now. Probably still a factor, but it seems like it's becoming less and less of one each week. Looking forward to seeing the Saints offensive tackle situation later in the week, once injury reports are finalized. If that's a go, I could see Carr having a bit of a spike game. And yes, I'd lean Olave being the primary beneficiary there too.
We're going to breeze through this. I'm going to call this the worst game of the week. The Titans will be hosting the Falcons. The Titans were 1-point underdogs. They're now 2.5-point underdogs. Game total was 37, and that's really low, but it's now at 35. It's because the Titans will have Will Levis under center. They've even made comments suggesting some kind of committee approach. Wouldn't shock me if they just pluck Will Levis at the goal line for Malik Willis to run the ball in. Maybe they try to audition Derrick Henry. There's been trade rumors around him. Maybe they audition DeAndre Hopkins. I really just don't like the look of this at all for the Titans. The Falcons defense looks like an elite streaming option this week. The Falcons have allowed the 5th fewest pass yards to quarterbacks. They've allowed only 7 fantasy points a game to receivers on the outside. That's where Hopkins has lined up 2/3 of the time, is the outside. Maybe they put him in the slot more and try and get a few layup targets for Will Levis, but at this point, I honestly have no faith. And I think if I had to place one bet in this game, it would just be the under on whatever the Titans team total closes at. Ryan, do you have any hope for this Titans offense?
I think they're going to have an interesting game plan. I could see Levis and Willis coming out on the field at the same time a couple times. I think they said that for a reason. I don't think it's going to be pretty by any stretch of the imagination, but I do think it's going to be interesting. Levis is a good thing for Hopkins, like you said, but the one thing that I have here for Tennessee is you trade your best secondary player when your secondary is already weak. There's a bit of a waving the white flag to the locker room. Like you said, maybe Derrick Henry is on the move. Maybe DeAndre Hopkins is on the move. The situation in that locker room from a morale standpoint has got to be pretty dicey this week.
Yeah, on the Falcons side, Bijan Robinson no longer has a headache. That's good. He's off the injury report. Unfortunately for him, the Titans are a pretty stonewall run defense. They get their nose tackle, Ta'ir Tart, back this week. He practiced in full yesterday. When he's on the field, they allow 2.9 yards per carry. That's best in the NFL. When he's off the field, they allow 4.1 yards per carry. That's around league average. For those wondering, that means no, I'm not flexing Tyler Algier this week. You can still play Bijan Robinson because he's probably going to lead the team in carries, but also because he's had one of the best pass game roles among all running backs this year. But ultimately, I wouldn't get too cute. You could stream Ritter, but I think the main play here is just purely Bijan Robinson. Do you have any other thoughts here on the Falcons? Where it seems like it's going to be a pretty conservative game plan from them in this one.
Yeah, I think for them, especially with their long-term prospects, like you said, this is essentially a Ritter game. Like you can throw in Tennessee, but you can't really run on them. Maybe try to light the Titans up if you have a lot of confidence in him. But here's my thing here, Josh. And I'm going to talk about this game from a spread perspective on Friday. I'm actually kind of leaning towards the Titans because I think it's going to be contrarian, but still very undecided there. But here's the thing, Josh. Arthur Smith. First it was Kyle Pitts. Then you've done things with Drake London that none of us are happy with. And then the Bijan Robinson mess last week. Arthur Smith, please stop doing weird things, man.
Yeah, he's had some press conference comments this week that also did not do him any favors. He floated the idea of a 3-way running back committee out there. I think we can say this guy's certifiably a donkey with a lot of his play calling. People out there being like, oh, the Falcons are 4-3. Well, if you look at the teams they're beating, that's been a soft schedule. The real opponents they have not been winning against. Let's talk about a fun divisional matchup. We got the Packers hosting the Vikings. Packers were 1-point favorites. Now they're 1.5-point underdogs. I think that's how it should be. I was actually surprised personally that the Packers opened up favored in this one. Game total's 42. With the Packers, I don't have much to say other than this offense is a mess. Jordan Love hasn't had 200 passing yards since week 4. He's thrown 3 touchdowns and 6 interceptions over his past 3 games. Christian Watson's banged up. Aaron Jones has barely been playing. I have no faith that this team's going to score points against a Vikings defense that has been up and down this year, but has definitely been significantly improved compared to last year. I think this is another letdown for the Packers offense.
This is a big game for Green Bay. Season's kind of a bit on the line here. You lose this game, you're in trouble, especially to Minnesota, who's scratching their way back in the playoff game. Bunch of injuries on offense, like you said. The defense has been good, but I don't have any confidence in the Packers at all right now.
On the Vikings side, 2 of their past 3 games were a running back committee with Alexander Mattison and Cam Akers. Akers actually outcarried Madison in week 7, and Akers was more productive through the air. They both had, I believe, 3 targets, but I think Madison had, if I remember correctly, I think he had 3 receiving yards on those 3 targets, whereas Akers ended up with 30 receiving yards in this game. I think we're starting to look at what could become a 1A, 1B committee. Then you can't start either of them in fantasy, and then I can victory lap Alexander Mattison and Cam Akers, because I was fading both of them to start this year, and that has looked pretty good. They're now going to ultimately sandwich each other. Can't say that I dislike that for the hashtag takes. Ryan, anything more insightful to add here for the Vikings?
That's Jay Larky tweets. He hates Alexander Mattison as a person, and he's right. He's been right to this point. He's been right. This is what I'll say about the Minnesota Vikings. Actually, we talked about this yesterday. They came out with a huge effort game yesterday. They actually looked faster than the 49ers in a lot of areas, which was something that was pretty surprising. I don't imagine that kind of effort is going to be repeatable this week, especially on defense. But their defense has been trending up in the last 3 weeks, which is a positive for them. But this is what things ultimately boil down to. Kirk Cousins has been great this year. This is probably his best year to date. He's the reason they're still in the game, still in the playoff hunt to a degree. If the Vikings were 5-2, I think Kirk Cousins would be the second in the MVP market right now. He's been excellent. One thing I want everyone to keep in mind, too, though, is 70 yards and a touchdown of production against the 49ers last week came from Jordan Addison, essentially stealing an interception from a 49ers defender.
That's a good point there. Let's turn to the Seahawks hosting the Browns. Seahawks opened as 2.5-point favorites. They've now become 4-point favorites. I would assume at least part of that is that Deshaun Watson won't be playing once again. Game total was at 40. It dropped to 38. I think that's also Deshaun Watson. PJ Walker in at quarterback again. The Browns also won't have Jerome Ford, who has a high ankle sprain. I'm thinking Kareem Hunt's going to get the red zone goal line carries. He's probably going to get more pass game work. Splitting some carries with Pierre Strong, who's the more explosive probably more efficient runner. However, I think out of these two, I definitely lean Kareem Hunt for fantasy. The Seahawks, very surprisingly, have allowed a league low 2.9 yards a carry to running backs this year, but the 9th most receptions per game to running backs. One thing I've looked at is Kareem Hunt receiving overs. I have already dabbled on over 14.5, and I will continue to look, see if there's anything like longest reception. But at this point, the Seahawks have only been beatable through the air with running games. And then in the pass game, the Seahawks have been beatable in the slot. They've allowed the second most fantasy points per game. I think that's where Cleveland's going to attack. I think they're going to rotate Amari Cooper and Elijah Moore there. So I think either of them could have a big game. Would not expect both. I think it's probably going to be either or, given that it's PJ Walker. But I think that's kind of where the path to success will be for the Browns. Any other notes to add here where the Browns will face the Seahawks?
Poor Amari Cooper, man. I mean, PJ Walker, it does seem like Watson's, if I'll get back when I can. Doesn't sound enthusiastic. This is a team that, every year there's at least one team, and now this year there's two with Zach Wilson with the Jets, where a premium defense gets stuck with a quarterback who, 20 points is worth celebrating for a team like this now. I don't know how the salary ramifications will work, but why aren't you calling the Commanders about Jacoby Brissett right now? If you're Cleveland, just do something about the quarterback position, please, sooner than later.
I would agree there. I know some of my best ball teams took Jacoby Brissett in the final round as a bet against Sam Howell. Little did I know that might end up hitting because it's a bet against Deshaun Watson. Turning to the Seahawks. DK Metcalf practiced in full this week. He will be back. Tyler Lockett's not practicing right now with a hamstring injury. I don't know what's going on. I think Tyler Lockett's going to be okay, though. We said that about Metcalf last week. We'll continue to monitor that. My fantasy rankings are on the 33rdteam.com. They're free to view. I will stay up on top of it. I update them at least once every single day. When we look at the Browns defense, they allowed over 27 fantasy points to Lamar Jackson and Gardner Minshew. The other 4 quarterbacks they faced were all under 11 fantasy points. I would trend towards Geno having a rough day. Yeah. I think it's a ball control, run-heavy game plan for Seattle. Zach Charbonnet's been back at practice this week. He missed last week due to an injury. I think we're going to be looking at 20 carries from Kenneth Walker, potentially 10 carries from Zach Charbonnet. That, to me, feels like their path to winning. Is that kind of how you view this one as well?
Yeah, I mean, we saw the Browns give up a ton of points last week, but I think that's more of an aberration than anything else. We saw them shut down Joe Burrow's Bengals, saw them shut down the 49ers at full strength. And, the reality is, Geno Smith's made a lot of high difficulty throws over the last 2 years, pretty impressive throws, but he's scored 30. The Seahawks have scored 33 points over the last 2 games against the Cardinals and the Bengals. Those aren't exactly the 85 Bears we're talking about. So against this Cleveland Browns defense, I think the Browns secondary is going to give their wide receivers trouble. So I would mimic the Colts approach too. I'd come out run heavy for as long as I can.
Let's turn to the divisional rematch. The Broncos will be hosting the Chiefs. The last game they played was 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, the Thursday night game. It kind of just happened.
Yeah, I think it was 2
weeks ago. The reason I'm not remembering is, oh boy, that was a snooze fest. Hopefully this game's better. Can't really be worse than the first one. Broncos were 8-point underdogs. That's actually moved in their favor. The Broncos are now only a touchdown underdog at home. Game totals at 46. Week 7, Javonte Williams led the backfield in carries and routes run. The first time all year that a Denver running back led the team in both. He moved up my rest of season rankings. That was very exciting for him, since as fantasy managers, I talk about this a lot. We can't really start these running backs that are in committees on bad offenses. The only way we can ever legally start a Broncos running back is if it's a bell cow. And Javonte took a trend towards that. We like that he's inching towards that. The other note I had for the Broncos, Courtland Sutton continues to outproduce Jerry Jeudy. Jerry Judy's also on the trade block, apparently. I'm curious if he gets moved. It was very interesting. Last year, Jeudy was on the trade block, and then he was just too good. They didn't trade him. This year, he has definitely looked not like himself. And I think, not that we should expect trade deadline moves, but I'd say Jeudy looks like one of the more likely moves that could be made at this point, which would open up Marvin Mims, who has gotten almost no usage and no production the last few weeks, but I'd still be hesitant to drop him. I'd at least want to wait until the trade deadline passes. Anything else here, Ryan, for you on this Broncos team? What are they going to do here against the Chiefs?
Yeah, I'm close to being done with Jerry Judy myself, Josh. And it was 2 weeks ago that they played the Chiefs. Thankfully, AI's on the case, making the schedule better for all of us.
Yeah.
Been, as we've all seen, they've been wonderful primetime games at this point. As we get the Chargers and Bears this week. Now, Josh, back to the matter at hand here, Chiefs, Broncos. Denver has the raw materials to be chippy here. Their defense has played well recently. These teams faced each other a few weeks ago, as we said, so they're super familiar. The thing is can Russell Wilson go out and win a game? You don't need to score 35 points, but 20 would have been enough last week or 2 weeks ago. So I do think Denver can give the Chiefs a game here. They're just so inconsistent. They don't have a real identity yet, so I don't want to bet on that outcome.
Yeah, speaking of AI, the next 2 Thursday night matchups pretty fun. We've got Titans Steelers. Oof.
Yeah.
2 of the teams that we least like watching right now on offense. And then the week after, fortunately, they gifted us Panthers Bears. So
there we go.
Thank you, Allen Iverson. Now turning to the Chiefs. Let's talk about Isaiah Pacheco. I bet earlier today Isaiah Pacheco over 15.5 receiving yards, -112 on my bookie. It's already been juiced to -120 on most other sports books. Pacheco's been over this number 4 of his past 5 games. We've talked about this a lot actually on our Monday recap shows. The Pacheco workload keeps going up. The receiving workload's been consistent. At least 3 targets in 4 of his past 5 games. Running backs against Denver, if we look at the matchup, have the 3rd most receiving yards a game. And if we look at Pacheco's 15.5 receiving yards number, through 7 games, we have 10 running backs in 7 games that have gone over this number. Isaiah Pacheco over 15.5 receiving yards, -112 on my bookie. Sign up with promo code 33rdteam, get a little deposit match, and you too can bet on Mr. Pacheco. My one other note for this game is Rashee Rice is here. He officially ran more routes than Sky Moore in week 7. That was the first time it happened all year. Think of him just as an efficient starting wide receiver for a Patrick Mahomes offense. That's exciting. We've talked a couple times now about his upside. I truly believe Rashee Rice has top 20 fantasy wide receiver potential. He's not there yet, but I think in 2 to 3 weeks, that's very likely how we could be talking about him, where they're just funneling the pass game through Travis Kelce and Rashee Rice. They desperately need someone to step up alongside Kelce. Rashee Rice looks like the guy there. Any other notes here on the Chiefs? And do you think this offense gets going? Because it did not get going in their first run through against the Broncos.
Yeah, I mean, division games with a lot of familiarity. I get why that game was low scoring and a bit underwhelming, but at the end of the day, and I get a lot of feedback with this with power rankings is, you have the Chiefs too high, where it's like, listen, Patrick Mahomes is the MVP favorite again. The defense is giving up the 2nd fewest points in the league. Like, the Chiefs are the most reliable team in the league. So they should beat Denver. Like, if you're a survivor pool player and like, all right, I'm going to deploy the Chiefs this week against Denver, there's a lot of good options. So maybe I don't do that, but you're at least betting on the most reliable football organization that there is.
I am looking at a blowout. The Cardinals host the Ravens. Cardinals opened as 8.5-point underdogs. That's moved to 9.5. Game totals at 44.5. Looking at the Cardinals, we had a full running back committee with Amari DiMercado, Keontae Ingram, and the veteran Damian Williams in week 6. And then all of a sudden in week 7, they said, you know what, DiMercado, we love what we saw from you, which honestly wasn't much. And then he had 13 of 14 carries for this team and ran almost every single running back route. He was like I think his usage was the 3rd best or 4th best among running backs last week. Absolutely wild. The Ravens run defense has actually been kind of league average. That's really where you have to beat this team. Maybe you fire up a little DiMercado. I don't think I'm quite that bold, but if you just want a volume back, if last week repeats itself, DiMercado is that guy for you. Quarterbacks have greatly struggled against the Ravens. They are averaging under 5.5 yards a pass attempt. That's more than 10% lower than any other defense in the NFL right now. The Ravens have literally shut down pretty much every single quarterback out there. I have Marquise Brown, wide receiver 34 for the week. That's probably the lowest he'll be rest of season since Kyler Murray probably returns the next week. Ultimately, what I'm signaling with that ranking is you should probably find better options. You're hoping Marquise Brown gets hit deep, but I think I would bet against that this week. Anything to add here on the Cardinals? I I think if they score a touchdown, I'll be impressed this week.
Yeah, I'm kind of of the same mindset. The Ravens are giving up the fewest points in the league. That's kind of what they're known for. There's nothing that I really like about the Cardinals offense in this game in general. What you need for the Cardinals to be competitive here is the Ravens to have a letdown game after their big spike week against the Lions last week, coming across the country. And you need Arizona to find those high effort games they had early in the year. Otherwise, from a talent perspective, they have a big time uphill battle against one of the most consistent teams in the league.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, speaking of effort, like we talked about, the Cardinals, first 3 games, really high effort. The last month has been just kind of what we thought going into the year.
Yeah.
Past 4 weeks, the Cardinals have allowed more than 9 yards a pass attempt to quarterbacks, by far the highest in the NFL. Lamar Jackson might build on last week's success. I think there's another big day through the air in store for him. Arizona is also allowing the 5th most rushing yards a game to running backs this past month at nearly 5 yards a carry. Gus Edwards looks like a fantasy running back too. The way I'm seeing it, even though the spread is pretty intense for a road team, I think you're probably taking the Ravens or you're simply leaving this game alone. I don't think either of us have much faith in the Cardinals. Any other notes here on the Ravens? And do you kind of also think we could see Lamar build on last week, given that this Cardinals secondary looks like there's no fight left in them?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about this early in the year that Todd Monken's offense is essentially an investment in Lamar Jackson long term. If they're going to knock off the Bills, the Bengals, or the Chiefs in the playoffs, you're going to have to beat at least 2 of them in general. You need to be more successful through the air. So I imagine they're at least going to try to keep the momentum going with Lamar Jackson. Again, the only real concern here I have for Baltimore is letdown game, traveling across the country. It's pretty thin reason to bet on the Cardinals.
Guys, Ryan Reynolds, NFL on Twitter. His work is free on the33rdteam.com. Check out his expert picks and predictions for every game. That's already up on the site every Thursday. His power rankings hit the site on Tuesdays. And every Saturday, he lets you know exactly what he's betting on in each game. And my fantasy rankings each week, plus my rest of season rankings and trade value chart, are always up on the site, getting released on Tuesdays and Wednesdays. And all our articles link our free Discord. Hop in there, chat with Ryan and I, start sits, trade questions. We're there to help. Waivers, where we are doing our best. Each of us puts in a couple hours a week looking through those questions. And you also get our prop bets. You get DFS advice from Jordan Vanek. Discord's free. I don't know why you would not hop in there. We have about 3,000 members and growing. Before we get to the 2 island games, Sunday and Monday Night Football, the last Sunday game before Sunday night is the 49ers hosting the Bengals. The 49ers were 5.5-point favorites. They are now 3.5-point favorites. Maybe we could say that Brock Purdy is worth 2 more points than Sam Darnold. Because Brock Purdy's in concussion protocol, Sam Darnold will get his first start as a 49er. Game total also dropped with the Darnold news from 45.5 to 43.5. I think, Ryan, we have the ultimate test here. The ultimate test. How quarterback friendly is the Shanahan system? Can Darnold succeed? What are your thoughts on Darnold? I'm actually relatively optimistic since at this point, every single quarterback not named Trey Lance has gotten it done for the Niners the past half decade.
Yeah, I think he'll be fine. I don't think, Brock Purdy's actually been pretty good, but I think Darnold will be fine. Game plan wise, what comes to mind is long time ago, Mike Shanahan, when he got Jake Plummer, non-shotgun, single back formation, play action, roll Darnold outright, manufacture some. I'd be surprised if we don't see that early. And the other thing here is the Bengals don't have a significant pass rush, so I think that helps Darnold too.
One thing to note, Christian McCaffrey played every single snap on Monday night. The oblique injury did not seem to matter. I had him ranked fantasy RB1 last week. A lot of people were like, you can't do that. He has the oblique injury. This is why we can do it. The Niners really just have no regard for this guy's health. I couldn't believe what I was watching. Every carry just looked painful. Thinking about having a strained oblique and going through all that. On the Bengals side, it's actually not full doom and gloom for this offense. The 49ers are quietly giving up the 10th most fantasy points a game to receivers. And Joe Mixon's been horribly inefficient this year. I think that we're going to have a pretty pass-heavy game plan from the Bengals coming off the bye. The Niners have given up the 3rd lowest yards per reception to receivers this year. I think there's going to be a lot of manufactured looks for Jamar Chase, a lot of slants in this one. I think if a receiver is going to let you down, it's probably going to be T. Higgins in this contest. Jamar Chase, locked and loaded fantasy wide receiver 1. I have stubbornly kept him in my top tier of the rest of season rankings, along with Christian McCaffrey and Tyreek Hill. I think Chase is still the third most valuable asset in fantasy football. Any other thoughts here on the Bengals off the bye?
I really strongly considered having the Bengals beat the 49ers outright in my expert picks. I had them covering, still have them covering even with the line movement because, you have the Bengals coming off the bye week. Joe Burrow looked good in the 2 previous weeks before then, looked mobile again. As long as the Cincinnati Bengals can manage the 49ers pass rush, how you beat San Francisco is in the air on the perimeter, specifically with freak athletes like T. Higgins and Jamar Chase. So I'll double stack Burrow and DFS a little bit this week, and I'll probably take them in ATS pools too, as long as I can get them at least 3.5.
2 games left. Sunday Night Football. Chargers host the Bears. Chargers 8.5-point favorites. Game totals 46.5. The Chargers have given up the most pass yards a game this year, 335. And the Bears have given up the 4th most pass yards per game this year, 265. With the Chargers, Josh Palmer and Gerald Everett didn't practice Wednesday. We'll monitor those injuries. And when we look at the Bears against running backs, they've allowed the 5th lowest yards per carry to running backs this year. Bears have actually contained the pure runners, but they've allowed the 2nd most receiving yards per game. People out there have been frustrated with the Austin Eckler receiving role. I think especially if Palmer or Everett don't play, I really think we're going to see that this week from the Chargers. There were just too many Austin Eckler runs up the middle their past 2 games against the Cowboys and the Chiefs. You have any other Chargers thoughts here? I think they can win this one pretty handily.
Yeah, we're on the same page there. I think the offense runs through Keenan Allen and Eckler, especially Eckler this week. Could see him having, 10 targets type thing. You talked about this in the offseason. When Mike Williams or Keenan Allen was out, Eckler saw a big spike in passing game usage. And if Palmer also misses this contest specifically, I'm expecting that too. In general, the offense has not been the same since Mike Williams has left in week 3. It's been a little dicey. This is a pretty good correction spot for them. I'm going to touch on Quentin Johnston real quick because this is like a strange parallel that I thought of before. His early career usage reminds me a bit of O.J. Howard's, where you have this dynamic athlete that you took in the first round, but he's just running clear outs, and he doesn't look particularly impressive either when you're watching him. So I hope he progresses, but right now, I actually think if Everett and Palmer miss this contest, Donald Parham's the 3rd most reliable pass catcher in this offense.
Yeah, unfortunately, as a Chargers fan who watched them take Johnston in round 1, I think I'd have to agree with you. On the Bears side, a lot of people really love Tyson Bagent, and I'm going to put some sand on the fire. Tyson Bagent targeted running backs on 34% of his attempts last week against the Raiders. That's a lot. 20% is generally a lot. 34. The average depth of target on all throws, not just to the running backs, all throws from Tyson Bagent was 2 yards downfield on average. Bryce Young is the lowest qualified passer for air yards per attempt this year at 5.5. Bagent was at 2. So you might say, Josh, how do we exploit this? Well, I think Roschon Johnson, who's out of concussion protocol, I think he's really going to benefit here. I have him running back 19 for PPR. I think he's going to have a truckload of targets. And when we look at the receivers and tight ends, I think it's going to be another big DJ Moore week. Already talked about it, the Chargers have been friendly to pass games. DJ Moore was the only receiver or tight end with a target share of at least 15% last week. It was at 32%. He had 9 targets. He caught 8 of them, 54 yards. His average depth of target was 3 yards. I think we're going to get more of the same. I think Roschon Johnson and DJ Moore could have half, maybe 60% of the team's targets in this game if the Bears are actually trying to win this one. And I'd pretty much stay away from every other pass catching option, despite the quote unquote tasty matchup with the Chargers. Is that how you're seeing this one as well? That hello, Roschon Johnson in the pass game?
Well, Tyson Bagent had 162 yards passing last week. And before I answer your question, Josh, I'm going to throw a wild stat at you. Donta Foreman had over 900 yards rushing last year. He had 9 targets. He had 5 last week. And that's because of Tyson Bagent. So normally I don't think coaches want to stick a rookie quarterback, especially one like Bagent. If you have CJ Stroud, fine. Rookie running back's fine. But usually you don't want to pair a rookie quarterback with a rookie running back because of the reliability aspect. But if Roschon Johnson's in the game, I think he's running a route. If they need someone to block, they're going to go with Evans or Foreman. So I don't want to play him yet, but I'm very interested to see what happens here.
Let's talk about Monday Night Football. The Lions host the Raiders. Lions favored by 8 points. Game total was 44.5. It's gone up to 46. Looking at the Lions, I talked about this on Monday. I think Jahmyr Gibbs, you hold him or you sell him. We saw the ideal Jahmyr Gibbs game last week. Detroit's down 28-0 at halftime against Baltimore. David Montgomery's injured. Gibbs had 10 targets. He caught 9 of them. He had 27 fantasy points, third highest at the position last week. I don't think Montgomery plays this week, but there's still a chance that he does. So I think with Jahmyr Gibbs, you're about to get the hammer back in Montgomery. I don't think Montgomery's done anything for them to think that they should not keep feeding him tons of carries and give him the goal line work whenever he's healthy. And then in the pass game, Jameson Williams ran about half the routes last week. It's very encouraging. We're starting to see more integration into the offense, though it was a cardio day. 6 targets, 143 air yards. Did not reel in any of those targets. I think better days are ahead for him. Would still recommend stashing him on fantasy benches. Any other notes here on the Lions? And do you buy into these Jared Goff home road splits? Because if so, Jared Goff in for a massive day against the Raiders.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've been calling this a destruction spot for Detroit all week. That's a tough physical football team that just got their teeth kicked in last week. They're not going to be very happy this week. Prime time at home. Jared Goff's going to let it rip a little bit against the Raiders. Pass defense that's been much better than I expected, probably better than anyone expected. And then if Montgomery doesn't play, Jahmyr Gibbs isn't exactly a bell cow running back. He's more of a Kamara type back, high target share for a runner. But, they played in the negative gain script last week, so I'm not thinking he's seeing 10 targets this week. But I expect Ben Johnson to try to get Jared Goff going here, and, I expect him to jump out to a lead and never lose it.
Poor Josh Jacobs. The efficiency hasn't been there yet to hit 4 yards a carry in a game. And the Lions allow 56 rush yards a game to running backs, third lowest in the NFL. They also allow the 10th fewest receptions. So Jacobs has mostly been getting it done in the receiving game. I think he's going to have a fine enough fantasy day. I'm not saying not to start him, but for those out there, they're like, oh, better days are ahead. Look at the usage. I don't think better days are ahead for Josh Jacobs in week 8. One interesting note, every quarterback not named Lamar Jackson has reached 36 pass attempts against Detroit. I will be starting Devontae Adams, Jacoby Myers across a lot of my leagues because of volume. The matchup isn't scaring me too much. The Lions have allowed the 12th most fantasy points a game to receivers simply because of that pass volume. I will definitely be looking at some Jimmy Garoppolo pass attempts overs whenever that comes out. That has not come out yet. It looks like he's going to return from injury this week. If he doesn't, I certainly would not be betting on Brian Hoyer against the Lions. Any other thoughts here on the Raiders? And I think we can just assume for right now Garoppolo's playing.
Yeah, if this game has any shot at being interesting, Garoppolo needs to return because the Raiders just lost to the Bears by 18 points with Tyson Bagent at quarterback who threw for 162 yards. If they put together a similar outing against the Lions, it's going to be bad. So let's hope and pray for our viewing pleasure that Jimmy Garoppolo at least can make this a little bit close.
I certainly hope so too. Folks, that'll do it for our week 8 game by game preview. If you want more content from us, check everything out on the 33rdteam.com. Ryan, what he's betting on comes out in a couple days. We'll be very active in our Discord. We got the player prop happy hour tomorrow with the two of us and Ben Wolby. So we'll drop some prop bets for the good people tomorrow. Hop in the Discord. From myself, from Ryan Reynolds, from the 33rd team, Taylor Swift, from all of us for week 8. Thank you, everyone.